I will be welcoming on stage Kate. So, Kate, you need to tell us also more about you, just so, while I'm finding your presentation, because you're not lighting focused. So that's a very interesting point of this today discussion about the multidisciplinary. So come here while I'm setting you up and say to everyone who you are.
Ooh,
yeah, perfect.
Okay. Hi everybody, my name is Kate van Someren and I am not a lighting designer. I work in our building performance and systems team, and my role in that is looking at how we actually use spaces in practice and then feeding that back in a design loop. And the way that we do that is by gathering occupant feedback and data from people who use spaces. And that might be workplaces, it could be multi-use spaces, or even residential apartments. And we kind of combine that with some energy data and looking at how people have procured different systems, or maybe how they've used different practices over time to use the space in action. And part of what I'm going to talk about today is my engineering doctorate was based at the University of Reading some time ago now, where I spent 4 years embedded in their facilities and maintenance and management team that was looking after the estate. So I want to invite you to remember how it felt to be a learner, and whether we're thinking back to the very early days of when we were being taught potentially by our teachers, or maybe in a different environment in higher education, then maybe you want to think around some of those emotions that were listed around being excited to be there. You're learning that topic that is your favourite one. Maybe you're anxious and you don't necessarily want to be there, and so that elicit some other feelings around what it is you're going to gain from that experience of learning. You're feeling curious, maybe it's playful and fun because you're remembering all those thoughts of who those people are that you're going to be seeing that day. But it's about that, what Dan mentioned, that collective enjoyment in being there, hopefully, that focus and having some feedback. So that feedback being really apparent in what do you commit to your memory when you're trying to learn. Okay, so one of the very first parts of this journey that I took when I was based in the estates team was I wandered down the hallway to the maintenance shutter. It was up, rang the bell, and the lovely maintenance team member came to the desk, and I said, "Please may I see all the lighting controllers you have?" Because I'd finally set upon the mission of I could control the lighting differently, or I could ask these questions around how is it being used in practice. And I was presented with a case that looked slightly like this, and I put lots of bubbles here because it was literally just spilling out. The different controllers across the 500-acre estate were ridiculous. And the chap behind the desk said, "Good luck. I have no idea what any of those are used, where they're going to be used, or how they work, even if they work." And so that was the reality that faced some of the questions in my doctorate of the everyday difficulty of being a maintenance technician in a really big estate. And so they had these hundreds of buildings all over the campus, different spaces, different controls, and I realised that in the wonderful world of could you have a control that's all the same, that was definitely not the reality. And it's not the reality we see now in the work I do at Arup with the types of control and use of space, because it is very disparate and difficult to understand how these things were going from the design intent and the conceptual model to how they're really used in practice. And that gap is enormous of how somebody communicates that between different life cycles and stages. So we're now going to kind of dive into 3 different levels across the estate, across the building, and thinking back to that learner. And one of the many interviews that I conducted, and amongst all this qualitative data that I got in classrooms and corridors and offices, was this message of I'd standardise it across the university. So I'd go into one place and everything works in the same way in all rooms, and I think that's one aspect of it. And part of this is being in that position of being the learner, because the learner does go into the spaces and use it. It's not just the lecturer, it's not just the cleaner or security or the porter or the maintenance technician. These are all different people with different conceptual models of how they're going to use a space, what they need that light for. Is it to go and clean up something that's happened in a particular science lab? Is it hazardous waste? Are they going in there for security reasons, to go and help support a student? There are a multitude of different reasons why somebody is in a space, and having some salient, easily accessible controls that somebody can go in there with no training, notices, any other paraphernalia that sits around it is really critical. And these are spaces that were used by the members of the public to arrive at lectures, and they're all very, very different. So part of my work looked at the kind of Donald Norman user-centered design principles, which looked at things like affordances. Could you touch it on with your elbow? Could you use something else if you didn't have access to using all your digits so easily? Are there signifiers that tell you it's on, like the backlights? How quick is the feedback from when you press it to the reaction of what's going on in the time? Obviously, we've talked around the conceptual model, and how does it map to the room? And those were really lacking in the spaces I saw. So we now move to the building level. There's another quote here, which I really want to kind of embed. How often do we ask people who are teaching in the spaces what their opinion is? Because this one respondent said, it's really weird that people are installing things into teaching spaces where the folks who are installing them have never spoken to anybody that uses them or imagined how they might be used. It's terrible. The lighting is appalling. It's very grounding feedback that was very honest from this person that I'd interviewed, because they're so frustrated, and that's what came across. And obviously the estate's moved on, but the life cycle of those kind of pragmatic parts of payback don't necessarily catch up with this person's sentiment and their experience of being behind the lectern, like now, and then feeling like they're lacking control. And that lack of control is huge, and we see it in our survey data as well. One of the few things people have control over in a space is lighting. They can't control the heating necessarily, they can't control the ventilation. To some extent the noise, but even then it's difficult. So lighting bears the brunt of that, because that's the thing that they can actually do something to a greater or lesser extent that is in their control. And it's really difficult because in these spaces, when I was talking to these respondents, they knew that their students needed a connection to outside for some rest. They wanted to see the time of day. And yet, for different reasons, whether a space was being used as a classroom or maybe it's turned into an exam room, that same space becomes an exam hall. It has to be bright. They have to be able to see what's happening for security reasons, for seeing around all the students, making sure they're okay. The hand dryer goes off in the toilet next door. It's like one of those blasting vortex ones. It distracts everybody. A leaf blower's outside. There's so many other different parts to this around how we experience these spaces. One of the parts that came up that I haven't mentioned here is the window cleaning strategy at the university was almost nothing, non-existent. Each school had to fund its own budget to clean the windows on every single building, so they were never cleaned. In the 4 years that I spent there, this one academics office had never had clean windows, and they just pulled the blinds down to mask all the horrible dirt marks that are outside their window. That's not what we want, and we know we'd like to fund a different place, but that's the reality with which universities are facing particular spaces. And I think to a certain extent schools are as well, with budget constraints. So this was a real space. This is probably still in existence because this is now a listed building. And these blackout blinds were pulled down because it's a south-facing particular building that still exists. Teaching still happens, exams still happen in this. And they really were not holding back with the feedback and understanding that the students' performance was really suffering in this type of space. They were doing master's level work for a whole week, trapped inside this space, not really any daylight outside, and really struggling with their ability to hold their attention and focus. So we're going to go back to that bit about memory. If that's what your experience is on your master's course and you remember that is the space that you're learning in, you're not really getting the experience you paid for at your university course. And the same can be applied to a school, in school settings, where I've seen school blinds closed and things are incredibly dark. It's difficult for students to see what they're meant to be doing. So this next one is more just to adopt, I think, what Dan suggested as the multiple different modes of learning. And I noticed in the foreground here, there's a particular learner that has headphones on, is learning in a different space. And certainly from our own research in spaces around people with neurodiversity, there's completely different variations in what people need, obviously, to suit their own attributes. But sometimes that's a much quieter, darker space than you might imagine. And it's one that is tailored to what they need to help them feel safe and engaged in a way that they can learn that matters to them. They're still part of it, and yet they can still be focused on what is being delivered in the main area. But as Dan suggested, it needs to be this blend of different spaces for different reasons and different learning styles that we need to look at next. So I think I'd like us to think around how did it feel to be a learner as the aspect to take forward for the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much. And we have the panel that is coming. So we have some questions, and I hope also the audience is thinking about the questions that you would like to share. So